The 1950s in the United States. A chrome-plated wonderland of great American automobiles. As wide-eyed optimism washed across the country, it also echoed from the assembly lines of Detroit. And the role of the automobile was about to take on an even greater significance in the way we measured our national self-worth. America had survived yet another world war. We shared an unspoken collective attitude that hinted, now, having made the world safe for democracy, it was time to reward ourselves. And to do that, many Americans chose a new automobile as the most satisfying of methods. And it was another survivor of sorts back in the 1950s that was already a veteran of 5 decades of industrial conflict. And we clearly remember it as being the vehicular embodiment of status, prestige, and success to a country ready to rediscover itself. That car was the Cadillac. And in many ways, how it maneuvered through a series of internal struggles, leadership changes, economic crises, financial blunders, and international rebellions is a colorful mosaic of varying ingredients, not uncommon to great American success stories. Detroit, Michigan at the turn of the century was a rugged, rowdy industrial center. It was already the home of literally hundreds of fledgling automotive companies headed by brash, well-heeled entrepreneurs who saw the automobile as nothing more than something with which money could be made. There was a riptide of cynicism that accompanied this atmosphere of corporate initiative. The automobile could be a profit center, but many of these daring financiers wondered to themselves and to others whether the automobile had the staying power to convince the masses that the future would be powered by internal combustion. Henry Ford had yet to become the manufacturing legend who would revolutionize automobile construction. In fact, many of the players that would soon be bathed by the world automotive limelight were still years away from building their fortunes. And one such figure, born amidst the rural placidity of the state of Vermont in 1843, arrived in the hurly-burly of 19th century Detroit at the age of 47. A highly skilled engineer and machinist, he became enmeshed in a series of canny strategies and puzzling serendipities that resulted in the creation of one of the world's most enduring automobiles. His name was Henry Martin Leland.
He was a master of precision in 1890 when he arrived in Detroit at a time when Detroit virtually knew nothing about precision machining. It was a rough and tumble town, and Leland brought his brand of refinement to machining in Detroit and became quite successful in partnership with a man named Falconer. They made gears, and as time went on, they also made engines. The Leland and Falconer Company was renowned in Detroit at that time.
Leland had already perfected his craft of precision machining years earlier, when he worked side by side with the great firearms manufacturer Samuel Colt in Connecticut. His fastidious attention to detail would become an indelible byproduct of his approach to building automobiles.
The most popular car in the country, soon after the turn of the century, was a little runabout that had one cylinder and was called the Oldsmobile. It was made by Ransom Eli Olds. It was an adorable little vehicle and very handsomely priced, meaning it wasn't terribly expensive, and it was certainly reliable for its time. There were so many orders for the Oldsmobile, and there had been a factory fire, which was very common in those days. Factory fires were commonplace. Virtually every day there was an automobile factory burning down, and there were hundreds of automobile companies then. In any case, the factory fire and the popularity of the car meant that Ransom Olds farmed out a lot of his component production. Manufacturing engines for him were 2 companies. One of them was the Dodge brothers. They were machinists in Detroit. And the other was Leland and Falconer.
At the 1901 Detroit Automobile Show, one of the first flashes of irony that would steer the direction of Henry Leland manifested itself as nothing more than a casual comment made by another visitor to the Detroit show. Leland had attended the show with his son Wilfred, his lifelong confidant and business associate. Both men were at the Oldsmobile exhibit, looking at a Leland-built engine on display. Another gentleman nearby pointed out the engine had been fitted with a brake to decrease its power, to perhaps make it more closely match the Dodge-built engine's output. After learning that, Leland was inspired to build an even more powerful one-cylinder engine, producing 10 1/4 horsepower. After building a prototype, Leland offered his new engine to Ransom E. Olds, hoping Olds would be eager to purchase a new engine for his cars. But Olds turned down the offer.
One of the reasons was that they couldn't build enough curved dash Olds for the demand anyway, so why should they improve it if what they had was already selling like hotcakes. The second reason was they would have had to have retooled, because in order for the chassis to have accepted this more powerful engine, it would have had to have been beefed up substantially. So that left Leland with his wonderful new 10 1/4 horsepower engine and no place to go, so to speak. Well, fortuitously at this time, he came in contact, more or less, with the same man who'd been standing next to him at the Detroit Automobile Show and had noticed the cheap brake even before Leland did. That man was Henry Ford.
Although the automobile was still toddling through infancy, automobile racing was quickly growing into a popular pastime. Scorchers, as race drivers were called, could be found chugging and chattering their way through any number of loosely organized events, such as open road challenges or tours, held almost exclusively on public roads. Hill climbs were another way that automobiles and their owners could show off before curious onlookers. Henry Ford had more interest in the competitive possibilities of the automobile than in its production in the early years of the 1900s. As he wrote in a letter to his brother during that period, "I can make dollars in racing, but I can't make sense in manufacturing." Ford's racing exploits led to a number of land speed records, and the legendary daredevil turned race car driver Barney Oldfield drove several Ford-built race cars to victory. But Henry Ford was in a manufacturing partnership with several other industrialists, including Lemuel Bowen and William Murphy. The Henry Ford Company was one of the countless embryonic automobile corporations in Detroit, attempting to cash in on this emerging industry. Although the operation bore his name, Ford was only a manager, since the company was being capitalized by his partners, who were less than pleased that Henry Ford's goals were at cross purposes with theirs. In the summer of 1902, Henry Ford terminated his association with his partners. Bowen and Murphy then made a critical decision that would have an enormous effect on automotive history.
So at that point, they called in Henry Leland, merely to assess the plant, to see how badly they had burned in their association with Henry Ford. They just wanted to bail out lock, stock, and barrel. Henry was perfectly willing to leave. He took his racing car drawings with him, and he insisted upon taking his name with him too. He didn't want them to use the Henry Ford name anymore, and of course they were enormously willing to do that. They didn't want anything to do with Ford either. So in any case, Leland arrives at the plant and does indeed do the appraisal, checks out the tools and all that sort of thing, goes back home, tots up a few figures. But when he came back, he also brought back his engine. And he said to Murphy and Bowen, he said, look, he said, this is what your plant is worth, and you can go out of business and just sell everything if you want to. But why not stay in business? This automobile business, I mean, this automobile is a common thing. You know, granted, everybody kind of thinks it's a fad now, but it's really gonna go gangbusters. And I've got this wonderful new engine. It's ever so much more powerful than the olds. Why don't you stay in business? I'll make the engines for you, and I'll design you a car. All you have to do is build it. So they decided to stay in the automobile business.
It was August of 1902 when the newly formed company was established. America was becoming more and more comfortable with what technology could provide. Automobiles up until that point were indeed simply horseless carriages. In fact, many of the automobile builders were converting horse-drawn carriages into truly dreadful automobiles. the automobile company that Henry Leland envisioned would bring a new chapter of mechanical creativity and exacting uniformity to an industry that relied many times on forcing components to fit together with primitive tools and old-fashioned arm strength. Detroit had recently celebrated its bicentennial, and so it was decided the new company would be named after the French explorer credited with discovering the area where Detroit was founded, Antoine de la Motte Cadillac. The early 1900s was a dizzying, up-tempo period for American industry, as America's most imaginative minds brought the age of manufacturing into the foreground of big business. For the newly formed Cadillac Automobile Company, with Henry Leland as director, this would be a most profitable moment in history to be launching their products. In the fall of 1902, 3 Cadillac prototypes were built. Expected to be priced at $750, they were single-cylinder chain-driven runabouts, ironically named Model A's.
So they got the cars together, the first cars, and they went to the New York Automobile Show. One of the smartest things that they did at this time was to hire a fellow named William Metzger as their sales manager. He was a super salesman, number one. He knew automobiles. He was the first automobile dealer in the city of Detroit. He organized the first automobile races. Henry Ford participated in them, needless to say. And he also had organized the first automobile show in Detroit. So he was really well ensconced in what was the nascent automobile industry, as it was at that time, and the birthing of the industry. Well, they took the Cadillac to New York for the automobile show, which was the mecca at that time for all serious automobile endeavors. And within the week, they had sold over 2,200 cars. This was virtually unheard of. They took a $10 deposit with each car, and midweek, William Metzger had to declare, and of course very grandly, the Cadillac is sold out. Because back at the factory, they knew it would take them a long time to make 2,200 cars. So the Cadillac was sold out. It was absolutely the smash hit of the New York Automobile Show.
Cadillac production moved into full swing in March of 1903. Engines and running gear were produced at the Leland and Faulkner factory, while the finished automobiles were assembled at the former Henry Ford Company facility. Henry Leland took every opportunity during the early months of Cadillac production to publicize how his precision machining techniques led to a more durable and reliable vehicle. Newly completed Cadillacs were frequently put through punishing road tests on city streets, so that the public could see firsthand how well the Cadillac could negotiate a hostile driving environment. Alanson Brush, a Cadillac engineer and test driver, climbed the front stairs of the Wayne County building in downtown Detroit in a Cadillac prototype, while being cheered by enthusiastic onlookers. It was a feat that would be duplicated at similar sites across the country by Cadillac salesmen and owners.
In the early years, just driving on the everyday road was a trial in itself. There weren't things like the roads we have today that are well paved. They were just kind of car tracks with holes and potholes in them. So a car didn't need a test track to test it out. All they had to do was drive out the front door of the factory and take a turn. And so instead of racing, because you couldn't go fast on these roads, they did things like hill climbs and Pikes Peak, the climb to the top of Mount Washington, were a couple very well-known events. And then every town had its own little hill that they went up and tested the vehicles on. There also was the Glidden Tour, which was a tour of cars. They would pick an area from A to Z to go to, and it helped promote building of roads, because the press would see that the cars could do it even though the roads were almost non-existent.
Between 1903 and 1907, Cadillac was well on its way to becoming the superior automobile Henry Leland had sought to create. But even during Cadillac's early growth period, several problems threatened to prematurely rob it of its impending success. A factory fire in April of 1905 exaggerated an already chronic inability to keep up with orders. Cadillac was actually turning away business. And Leland's partners were unable to handle the administrative duties of managing an automobile company. having to oversee two separate facilities was increasingly unwieldy. In October of 1905, Leland's partners demanded a change.
An ultimatum was given to the Lelands. Look, you have to take over the whole operation, but we're going to shut it down. I mean, we're just getting tired of this whole thing. We can invest our money in coal or something else. And with that, Leland said, okay, that he would take over. So Leland and Faulkner and the Cadillac Company were merged. And Leland, who was in his 60s by then, was made the president. Wilfred, I believe, was made the assistant treasurer under Murphy. Their production man at Leland Faulkner name was Ernest Sweet, and he came along with the triumvirate. And it is said that on the day that Henry Martin Leland, his son Wilfred, and Ernest Sweet walked into the front gates of the Cadillac Motor Car Company, one cynical member of the management staff was said to turn to another and comment, well, our troubles are over. Here come the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
By now, Cadillac has become the largest producer of motor vehicles in the world. There are now 1,000 employees, and demand for Cadillac automobiles is spiraling ever upward. By 1908, Cadillac has now made a 4-cylinder engine available in addition to its single-cylinder power plant, had broadened its model line to include Tourers, Roadsters, their first closed body style, along with their ever-present runabout. Built upon Henry Leland's unwavering commitment to precision parts production, Cadillac continued to sell more and more automobiles. Not yet considered a premium automobile, the Cadillac became the country's most popular middle-class car. But a development 5,000 miles away in 1908 would take center stage in Cadillac's journey toward global recognition. Frederick S. Bennett, an English auto salesman and enthusiast, had imported the first Cadillac into Britain in 1903 and was most impressed with its careful construction. A quality that Bennett felt made it deserving of a very special award.
There was a trophy that was given out every year called the Dewar Trophy. It was given to the automobile manufacturer wherever in the world who came up with the most significant advancement of the year. What won the Dewar Trophy in 1908 was a very interesting test with 3 Cadillacs that was done in England. At Brooklands Track, which was kind of like the 8th wonder of the world, he had all 3 of them dismantled, and their parts were just all jumbled up. Got 3 crews of mechanics, armed with nothing more than a simple toolkit, and they reassembled 3 cars from all of this mess of parts. And then they got in those cars and drove them around the Brooklands Track. Well, this was sensational. We were in an era when cut and try was the basic way most anything was done. You kind of hammered things until they worked. Granted, interchangeability of parts was something that other manufacturers were beginning to think about because it made sense if you were making more cars. But Henry Leland had been thinking about it for a long time. And out of this, a slogan was born, Standard of the World, and it has served Cadillac very well since.
In the opening decade of the 20th century, America's labor force had yet to organize. Working conditions in many factories were barely humane. They were especially unspeakable in the auto industry. Along with his unremitting devotion to precision tolerances in his designs, Henry Leland brought a strong fabric of Christian morality to a somewhat unholy industry.
Let's face it, at that time in the automobile industry, it was not very far from Dickens. So most automobile factories tended to be very dangerous places and very unpleasant places to work. And you worked for employers that really didn't care much about you. Leland was quite different. He was very benevolent. Cadillac workers tended to be better paid. Leland was very much a family-oriented man. He cared about his people. He cared very much about their health. He was generally a very caring, very patriarchal person.
It was in 1908 that a percussive series of circumstances would unfold that would set the compass needle of not only Henry Leland and Cadillac, but also corporate America itself. They were the result of an ambitious automotive wag who was charting a bold financial course in a young industry about to hit immeasurable pay dirt. His name was William Crapo Durant.
Billy Durant's idea was that he wanted a car for everybody. And instead of one company making a lot of cars, he wanted to have a bunch of companies making a bunch of cars. He was at that time president of Buick, and Buick was doing extremely well. So he used Buick as his cornerstone, and he started a little company in 1908 called General Motors. Into General Motors he brought Olds Motor Works, and one of them that he wanted very much was Cadillac, because he had Buick and Olds, and Cadillac would have been a prestige car, and it would have, Cadillac was doing so well, they would have really known how serious he was.
After some hard negotiating, Durant succeeded in adding the Cadillac nameplate to GM. The Lelands would stay on and manage Cadillac in the same capacities they had held. Durant paid the hefty price of $3.25 million, plus $75,000 of General Motors stock. It was a transaction that would have dramatic consequences on the fates and fortunes of both sides. Over the next 3 years, as Cadillac was becoming GM's most profitable division, Billy Durant's corporate buying spree continued.
Most of the companies that Billy was able to buy, he bought for stock. He very seldom laid out any money. He didn't really have that much money, but he sold them on the idea of just stock in General Motors and this, which of course turned out to be a very good deal. But the automobile business was so risky at that day that it was Billy's charm that really sold him on it. So he was able to sell a whole lot of people, and he was buying companies right and left, because as he said at the time, nobody knew what the automobile business was going to turn into. He bought one company because it had a two-stroke engine. He bought another company because it had a friction transmission. He said, who knows what the engineers are going to come up with next? My idea is to buy everything just to be safe.
The banks holding General Motors assets became nervous. In September of 1910, Durant was forced to step down as head of GM. With the liquidation of GM looming, Wilfred Leland used the clout of the enormous cash flow of Cadillac to save the corporation. The Cadillac had once again proven its resiliency, and soon, Billy Durant would prove his. The mechanical revolution of the 1900s was now becoming a more tangible reality in the way America lived. The working class was now the middle class, and owning an automobile was becoming more commonplace in the country's urban centers. By 1916, Cadillac had not only thrived, but galvanized its image as a technological leader. An unprecedented second Dewar Trophy in 1913 was due in large part to the industry's first self-starter in 1912. It was an amazing accomplishment.
There's been this wonderful legend which has been told for years about Byron Carter, who was building a car in Detroit called the Carter car, who stopped on Belle Isle Bridge in Detroit in the middle of winter one day to help a woman whose car had stalled. Now in those days, you cranked a car cranked in front. And broken arms were very much the norm in that era. You frequently broke an arm cranking a car because it was none too easy a thing. In this case, because Carter was hit by the crank as he was trying to crank it, and he ended up in the hospital and died. At this, Henry Leland said, "Oh my heavens, I will drop everything to, I will not kill any more people with automobiles. I will stop all production until we can satisfy this problem, correct this problem, because I do not want automobiles to kill people." Well, all of this is an absolutely wonderful story, except for the fact that Byron Carter died in bed of pneumonia 2 years earlier.
In 1915, Cadillac introduced the industry's first mass-produced V8 engine. That same year, in the January 2nd issue of the Saturday Evening Post, an ad would appear that became a Cadillac advertising legend. Entitled The Penalty of Leadership, it emphasized Cadillac's innovative resiliency with the line, "That which deserves to live, lives." 1 year later, in 1916, Billy Durant's corporate cleverness returned him to the top of General Motors, which by now had acquired the Chevrolet nameplate. But the drumbeats of America's entrance into World War I were rolling, and Durant and the Lelands would come to an irreparable loggerhead.
The break with the Lelands and Billy Durant came when World War I was declared. Henry Leland was very anxious to get into military production, very anxious. A consortium of engineers in the industry had developed the Liberty aircraft engine, and he thought that Cadillac should build it right away. Well, Billy wasn't so, perhaps he was a pacifist, as Henry Ford was at that time, but at that point the only war Billy wanted to wage was to get back into control, to cement his control in General Motors. And so he didn't get into military production quite fast enough for the Lelands, so the Lelands just simply walked out. I mean, Henry was what? He was close to 80 at that time. And they started another company to manufacture the Liberty engine. And Henry named it after the first president he had voted for. It was known as the Lincoln Motor Company.
The Lelands' abdication of their beloved company startled Detroit. While they embarked on their new patriotic venture, Cadillac would play its own vital role in the production of military vehicles of all types. Cadillac would be named the official staff car for the Allied Army and would become instrumental in the Allied victory. But back on the home front, Cadillac was battling in the automotive war zone as well, against three separate but determined adversaries that were leading the premium car field. The three Ps: Packard, Peerless, and Pierce Arrow. Cadillac still had ground to make up, but following the war, an economic recession would help level the playing field.
World War I ended too soon, unfortunately, because all of the companies, all automobile companies, had geared up for military production, and all of a sudden there was the armistice. I mean, they were very happy that the war to end wars was over, but it sure put them in a terrible fix. There seemed to be a revolving door at Cadillac after the Lelands left.
By this time, Billy Durant had lost GM for the second and final time, after once again overextending the company's resources. Chaos would turn GM and Cadillac into an epicenter of corporate quick fixes, with presidents and managers coming and going almost overnight. Miraculously, Cadillacs were still making headway in the marketplace. They remained innovative. The operation was expanding. And then, in April of 1925, a significant step in Cadillac's upswing took place when 37-year-old Lawrence Fisher, one of the 7 Fisher brothers who had gained great success as automobile bodybuilders, became the new president at Cadillac. With America pulling out of the post-war recession and the roaring 20s in full step, Cadillac was riding the wave of this economic resurgence. Sales were on the climb. Cadillac's model line was expanding almost annually. But elsewhere in Detroit, other events did not bode so well for Cadillac. Henry Leland's Lincoln Motor Car Company had gone into receivership in 1922 and was purchased by Ford. It was now staging a strong run in the premium car market. Walter P. Chrysler was launching his company with an eye toward chasing down the upper-class automakers. And Cadillac found itself needing that one magic bullet that the competition didn't have. In 1927, Larry Fisher thought he had found it when he hired an imaginative West Coast designer to join his team. That designer was Harley Earl.
Harley Earl was one of the towering figures in the history of styling in American the American automobile. He stood, 6'4.5" or 6'5.5". I'm not sure. He was rather a fop or a dandy if he'd been born several centuries earlier. You can imagine what they thought when this fella from Hollywood showed up in Detroit. Well, and indeed he did show up in Detroit, because Lawrence Fisher was so impressed by what he could do as a designer that he hired him to design what was to be the new companion car for Cadillac. Most of the car companies at that time were building smaller companion cars, pony cars or something like that. And Cadillac's was going to be named after another explorer, LaSalle. So he brought Harley Earl to Detroit to design the LaSalle. Well, Harley Earl took his, as inspiration, a fabulous, continental, glamorous, sexy car that was known as the Hispano Suiza, and was also a famous racing car. I mean, it was absolutely an absolutely lush, totally glamour car. And he styled the LaSalle after the Hispano. It was a wonderful car, just absolutely longer, lower, in an era when cars remained pretty much boxy.
The style was much easier, more pleasant to the eye. It was an easier car to handle, it was a smaller car, although it had the same connotation as being built by Cadillac, where they used all Cadillac components. The only difference was size-wise. It was a much smaller car, it was easier to handle, and it was addressed to having the women drive the car, as it was a very easy car to handle.
The 1927 LaSalle is an immediate sensation. In 1927 and 28, over 26,000 LaSalles were sold. The public was buying into the idea of a smaller, lighter, lower-priced car that shared a host of Cadillac virtues. Cadillac's other models were also doing well, resulting in a combined Cadillac and LaSalle sales record in 1927 of over 41,000 cars. LaSalles were also performance successes outside of the showroom. Automotive headlines were made in 1927 when Big Bill Rader drove a stripped-down production LaSalle 951 miles in 10 hours. A stunning accomplishment. The nation's economy in 1928 was moving at hyperspeed. Over 56,000 Cadillacs were sold, of them 16,000 LaSalles. It was a sales record that would stand until 1941, thanks to an unforgettable day in October of 1929. The Great Depression devastates the American economy. Nothing will ever be the same again. And Cadillac is now faced with the greatest challenge to its existence it has yet to encounter.
What no one was expecting, of course, was the stock market crash, because they thought the good times would go on forever. And Cadillac at this time was very much engaged with Packard as to which was really the number one of the top line cars in this country. It was a fierce battle between Packard and Cadillac, and Packard was winning. And this did not seat too well with the people at Cadillac. And they began to devise what they could come up with in the way of an automobile which would out-Packard Packard. Well, they came up with an absolute glorious doozy of a car that had 16 cylinders. I mean, think of it, 16 cylinders. Most cars at that time had 6. The Model T still only had 4, and the Model A, which followed it. So 16 cylinders was absolutely, I mean, the ne plus ultra of automobile design. And these cars would have very, very sensational styling, too. One of the models would be called the Madam X, which, of course, kind of bespeaks intrigue and mysteriousness. Not only did they have a 16-cylinder car, they also brought out a 12-cylinder car, so that if you didn't want 16 cylinders, maybe you could do with 12. I mean, it was absolutely an embarrassment of riches. Now, these cars were designed, the design of these cars was begun before the stock market crash. After the stock market crash, I mean, people often say, well, why were these cars built in the 30s? Well, no one knew that that was going to happen, but then they had the cars, so they had to sell them. As the Great Depression deepened, companies like Cadillac and Packard were in big trouble. Even those who remained wealthy and had the money to buy expensive cars frequently didn't want to be seen behind the wheel of an expensive car when people were standing on street corners selling apples. It was a difficult time, and there's no question but that Packard and Cadillac were hurting very, very much.
The financial safety net of Alfred P. Sloan's General Motors becomes a life support system for Cadillac. Retaining the V16 and V12 Cadillacs will prove to be an expensive proposition based on their shrinking sales and slim profit margins. But Lawrence Fisher has been moved upstairs at GM and convinces his colleagues that sacrificing Cadillac's image would be a mistake, since Cadillacs are outselling its upscale competitors. Cadillac has already lost one of its rivals, Peerless, which closes down in 1931. While Cadillac commits to staying the course, at Packard, a far different decision is reached.
What Packard did was to bring out lesser Packards. In other words, Packard had always been a big car. They brought out a small 6-cylinder version and a smaller 8-cylinder version. Small cars, a 110 and 120. And they were significantly cheaper cars. These cars sold for less than Packard's ever had. There is a continuing debate to this day about whether Packard sounded its own death knell by bringing out cheaper versions of its own car. Whether this lost for Packard its prestige, the importance of the name, because Packard all of a sudden could mean an inexpensive car as well as a really expensive car.
Cadillac weathers the Depression thanks to the determination of GM to do whatever is needed to preserve its prestige division. Despite its mid-course correction, Packard slips from its leadership role as America's premium automobile. Before 1960, Packard will be gone. Cadillac's survival, thanks to the efforts of GM, becomes a symbolic payback for Cadillac's rescue of General Motors 25 years earlier.
There has been created for the New York World's Fair a thought-provoking exhibit.
The 1939 World's Fair helps unshackle an economically weary country from the dreary hangover of the Great Depression.
The American scheme of living.
As the 1940s ushered in another economic boom period for America, Cadillac was firmly buttressed as the most prestigious automobile built in America. Cadillac innovations such as balanced engines, safety glass, vent windows, synchromesh transmissions, and sophisticated hydromatic transmissions fortified its image as America's automotive ruling class. But as of 1940, Cadillac had been trimmed down considerably. The V16 and V12 Cadillacs are gone. And soon, so was the car that had helped to generate a vital percentage of Cadillac's incoming revenues as Cadillac slowly recovered during the post-Depression years.
In 1940, LaSalle was outselling Cadillac by 3-1. And it was almost getting impossible to keep building LaSalle at Cadillac prices, Cadillac quality. And they just said, no, we can't afford to build the car. So they brought out the Model 61 Cadillac for 1941. And if anybody has one, they basically have a 41 LaSalle. And at that point, that ended LaSalle's life.
$66,130 Cadillacs are sold in 1941. For Cadillac, an all-time record. But once again, the course of Cadillac's history would take another abrupt turn as the world would once again go to war. Detroit would suspend production of new automobiles in February of 1942. And Cadillac would convert to the production of Allison aircraft engines, plus tanks, armored vehicles, and personnel carriers, almost all powered by the venerable production Cadillac V8 engine, tied to the Cadillac hydromatic transmission. Cadillac would play a significant role in outfitting the Allied armies with superior armored vehicles that helped to win the ground wars in Europe and in the Pacific theater. With the end of the war and the imminent arrival of a new decade, Cadillac was about to win even more ground in America's showrooms. As America settled into its familiar routine of business and pleasure following its victories in World War II, Detroit would move into its most brash and uninhibited era of automotive design. In 1949, Harley Earl and his heir apparent, William Billy Mitchell, who in 1938 had earned industry acclaim with his design of the classically elegant Cadillac 60 Special, endowed Cadillac with perhaps the most singularly distinctive styling cue ever to appear on any automobile, American or foreign built.
During the war, Cadillac built the Allison V-12 airplane engine, and it was used in quite a few fighter planes. One of the fighter planes was a P-38 Lightning, and that was a good-looking airplane. It was twin engine, and it was twin boom, which means it had two small fuselages and two tails on it. It was a very striking airplane. And Harley Earl was quite fascinated with this aero look, and because it had a GM-type heritage to it with using GM Allison engines, he had quite a few styling exercises around airplanes. One of them was a tail fin light housing, and that one was allowed by management to go into production, and that was 1948. And it seems that it was controversial at the time, but it went over very well with the public.
The tail fin was indeed a styling sensation. Through the decade of the 50s, Cadillacs became the cultural icon of wealth, status, and success. To drive or to be driven in a Cadillac was to gain almost automatic acceptance into the social register. With each succeeding year throughout this decade, the prosperity of America could be measured in many ways by the vertical height of the Cadillac's tail fins. In 1959, Cadillac styling had reached the ultimate limits of the imagination. It was truly a car for its time. General Motors saw its profits and prestige hit enormous highs during the automotive boom period of the 1950s. And the Cadillac was clearly the solid choice of America's rich and famous, who were now buying Cadillacs in record numbers. It was during this time that General Motors created a new kind of traveling roadshow.
The parade of new cars starts across the stage among the dancing motorettes. It's funny how ancient my own car seems as I look at them.
General Motors had a motorama, they called it. It was like a traveling circus or carnival that General Motors made up themselves. They had these very modernistic looking vans which they built that would go down the highway, and they would take these from town to town and set up. And it wasn't just Cadillac, it was all the GM products, but it showed the current vehicles that they were offering, but it also showed the future products that they were hoping to offer to get the interest and the excitement of the people. And this was kind of like the forerunner of the car shows today, where you go in and see these modernistic styling exercises that the manufacturers may or may not build, but they want to get the excitement up and show you what they're thinking about.
For the next decade, Cadillac, under the styling leadership of Billy Mitchell, creates some of America's most distinctive production automobiles, including the 1955 Eldorado, the 1957 and 58 Eldorado Brougham, and the 1957 and 58 Eldorado Baritz. Then, in 1967, Cadillac takes the lead of Oldsmobile, who a year earlier had produced its first full-size luxury car with front-wheel drive, the Toronado. Cadillac answers with the 1967 front-wheel drive Eldorado. Cadillac was now in its salad days. America wanted cars that were bigger, roomier, and had the style and luxury that resonated with upper-class elegance. It seemed there was no limit to how big and how powerful Americans wanted their luxury. But soon, the world in which Cadillac lived would be changing again, with little warning. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 and 74 changed the rules on how automobiles would be built. With an American auto industry blindsided by gasoline shortages and skyrocketing petroleum prices, Cadillac's survival was once again being confronted by outside forces.
The oil crisis was especially hard on Cadillac. It seems like the Cadillac's past has been everything it built upon, it went ahead. It was stronger. But the energy crisis came along, and its Cadillac's strong suit was a big automobile, a big engine, and a lot of power. And that just wasn't viable. There were long lines at the gas pump, and so Cadillac was kind of stuck. They tried to do some novel approaches. They used a diesel engine that Oldsmobile developed and was pretty much a dismal failure. They tried an interesting engine option where it was the regular Cadillac V8, and it was called an 864. Out on the highway it would run on 4 cylinders. Say around town it would run on 6, and then just pulling away from the stoplight, or if you needed the power, it would run on the full 8 cylinders. This also was rushed into production and had an awful lot of glitches.
The automobile industry as a whole was entering a severe recession, touched off by the oil embargo. The 1970s spawned an era of profound conservatism in Detroit. Chrysler would discontinue its Imperial in 1975 after 49 years of production. Cadillac had outlived yet another rival, but it was having serious difficulties adjusting to the changing world conditions. By the 1980s, Cadillac was the only GM division without a small economical offering to compete with the red-hot tidal wave of European and Japanese automobiles flooding the marketplace. It seemed as if the industry that Cadillac had helped to pioneer was now on a path of its own. Assembly techniques were becoming more sophisticated. Safety was becoming a bigger concern, along with smoother body styles to increase mileage, now that gasoline was getting pricier every day. But in May of 1981, Cadillac would come to the table with a car that would be decisively rejected by the automotive public. The Cimarron by Cadillac.
The Cadillac Cimarron was in response to several things. First off, the oil crises, which had been going on. Cadillac didn't have any small car in their mix. They had big V8 engined automobiles. But the Cimarron really wasn't the car that Cadillac had hoped for or wanted. It was rushed into production by GM. It was based on the J-bodied GM vehicle, and it was basically a Chevrolet Cavalier. And although companies use other body pieces and revamp them for their own use, this car looked like a Cavalier. It was basically a Cavalier at heart. It may had leather in it and nice trim, but it looked like a Cavalier and it felt like a Cavalier. And it just really didn't go anyplace.
Cadillac would soon abandon the Cimarron. But Cadillac's brain trust had not abandoned the idea of returning fire on the ultra-luxurious sports car contingent that wealthy Americans were buying in ever-increasing numbers. The luxury car market now accounted for 15% of total domestic auto sales. In the early 1980s, a $600 million deal was struck between Cadillac and the Italian designer and coach builder Pininfarina, who had designed the strikingly beautiful Eldorado Brougham 30 years earlier. This international joint venture resulted in Cadillac's ill-fated Alante. The Cadillac Alante bodies were built in Turin, Italy at Pininfarina, and then airlifted to Detroit in specially fitted Boeing 747s, where they were assembled at Cadillac. With a sticker price of $50,000, the Alante was squarely positioned in the upper end of the sports luxury firmament. But it was soon apparent that it needed work.
Unfortunately, it fell into the kind of GM-itis that they had. It came to market not as a refined automobile. The tops leaked. The top also was a manual lift, and quite a heavy manual lift. This was a car that was to be in the $50,000 price range with the demographics of an older buyer, and that kind of person didn't want to bench lift this top out of its compartment. Another thing is it came with a just an overhead valve V8 engine that was quite a few horses down than the Mercedes version, which was a sophisticated overhead cam V8. It had a racy European look to it. It was just that it didn't have these features that one was looking for right from the dealer's showroom. Now, by the time Cadillac phased this out, it had the North Star V8 system in it, and most of the other glitches had been engineered out by then, and Cadillac pulled the plug on it.
As the 1990s continue, Cadillac moves through a period of rebirth and redirection. Its product line is being favorably compared to some of the world's most prestigious automobiles. But it is Cadillac's fascinating past, its almost unsinkable corporate durability through a litany of crises and comebacks, and a legacy of engineering and technological trailblazing that has earned it the highest regard. Born from the vision and undaunted perfectionism of a Vermont machinist, the Cadillac has passed through a cultural obstacle course lined with economic and social stumbling blocks that have sometimes taken the full measure of Cadillac's opponents. There are many people who have carried Henry Leland's humble creation through the 20th century, and each one, in their own way, has been responsible for the endurance of the Crown and Crest.
Its name, quality, is basically what I attribute its longevity to. It's been well known. It's been here since the whole automobile industry basically started. And it's been a well-built car. When the Cadillac first came out, they turned about 1905 with Henry Leland. He knew what he was doing. And having the first really good American car built for interchangeability, it says a lot for Cadillac.
When we were growing up as kids, Cadillac meant quality, and it still does. Cadillac may have slipped and fallen a little bit. They're just kind of like people. They have the human problems, but they've dusted themselves off and come along. But Cadillac still means quality.
Given what the Cadillac is and was, their survival is even more remarkable. We no longer have Pierce Arrow, we no longer have McFarlane, we no longer have Locomobile, we no longer have dozens of companies that were begun to manufacture prestige automobiles. Indeed, we no longer have Packard as well, which was Cadillac's biggest rival. So the fact that Cadillac was able to survive the Great Depression I think bespeaks as much as any other facet of its history, the strength of the car. It was the standard of the world in 1908 when it first won the Dürer Trophy. That is a slogan that the company has worn with pride for a number of years. Cadillac is kind of like Plymouth Rock. It's solid. I can't imagine there not being a Cadillac. The day that there is no longer a Cadillac, I dare say we will no longer have cars, and we will simply be beamed places like in Star Trek. But as long as there are automobiles on the road, I think there will be a Cadillac. It has well stood the test of time.